Hello and welcome back to another video. In this one, we'll be covering the next scenario for the upcoming Russian offensive. In this one, we'll be covering the most likely one that is to happen, and that is the Eastern scenario. Here we'll be looking at a Russian buildup of soldiers and troops in the eastern border between Russia and Ukraine, and generally intensified offensive operations while also launching a new one here in the east. This is all to intensify the current operations taking place and speed up the process of how long it is going to take. The war is now in its second year, and the longer a war goes on for, the more risks arrive. At this point, it is becoming increasingly likely due to statements from Western leaders that there will be more involvement from NATO countries, and that risks escalating this conflict to one of a higher scale. To avoid that, the Russians are interested in finishing this war earlier rather than later. And at the same time, the effects the war itself has on the economies of the world, really, and the benefits the Russians would have with ending this war, it is obvious that finishing this war soon is in the interest of pretty much everyone involved. So with this, we see that the Russians are going to look to speed up the process of the war by launching a new offensive here in the summer period. And this is the most likely scenario due to the fact that this is the most straightforward. It's also one that aligns with the presented goals of the Russians and so much more. So to explain this scenario, we have to go over the same principles we did over the past two episodes, and that is that the Russian soldiers around the front line right now is about 600,000, and the Ukrainians are about 800,000. It is expected that the number of Ukrainian soldiers over the next months until the summer period would decrease to about 700,000, and the number of Russian soldiers would increase to about 700,000 if we assume that they take equal casualties. This number could differ according to how much casualties both sides take. But in that scenario, the Russians and the Ukrainians would be at a 1-to-1 rate at that point in time. At the same time, the Russians have about 200,000 in reserve elsewhere, and the Ukrainians have 200,000 of those 800,000 elsewhere within Ukraine, in the northern border mostly, but also throughout the front line, really. This would put it at 900,000 against 900,000 in the eastern border and the whole front line, really. So with this, we see that they will have a 1-to-1 rate of soldiers on each side. In this scenario, the Russians have pushed through during the spring season to fight here in the southern borders. But if it's a stalemate or if they have advanced, it doesn't make any difference for this operation. What this operation will focus around is here for the southern border, the Russians will restart offensive operations before they engage in the eastern border. The way they'll do this is they'll fight through Kupiansk in the north and try to capture the whole Oskil River line. So they'll launch offensive operations throughout this section of the front line towards the Oskil River line. In the central part, they'll attack towards Chasiv Yar in Bakhmut, from Avdiivka, both in the direction of Konstantinivka and towards Pokrovsk, as well as in the southern direction towards Pokrovsk, towards Volodar. And all of the generally considered important villages by the front, Volyaybole, Orikhiv, and so on. It will be a general offensive along the whole southern border, and this is to divert the majority of the Ukrainian armed forces here to the south. Then, while this fighting is taking place and has intensified in the south, the Russians will launch a general offensive in the east as well. This will span all the way from the north by Bryansk and down south to Belgorod, where they will look to capture Izium in the south and generally just create a buffer zone around the Russian borders all throughout the front line. This will also combine with assaults towards Sumy city itself, as well as Kharkiv city here in the east. At the same time, they'll look to break through the central parts between Sumy and Kharkiv which is why the sieges of these cities are important, simply to prevent the Russians from being flanked by the Ukrainians in this push towards Poltava. So this will be a general offensive by the Russians on the eastern front to create a buffer zone across the front line, sieging the cities of Sumy and Kharkiv, while also pushing possibly towards Izium in the east and towards Poltava in the center, depending on how this initial stage goes. Following the siege of Sumy and Kharkiv, the Ukrainians will likely divert some of their forces from the north and from the south to these locations to prevent the Russians from capturing these locations and cities, and this will weaken other areas. This is why it is important for the Russians to also launch these offensive operations in the south to keep the Ukrainian soldiers there, and if they redirect them, they'll be shot at through the movement from the south to the east, and at the same time that they will take advantage of any such redirection of forces. In this scenario, the Russians will look to do a general offensive, and whichever side has a breakthrough through the Ukrainian defenses, whether it is in the north towards Chernihiv, in the east towards Sumy or Kharkiv, to the south towards Izium, Liman, or generally just the Donetsk front itself, they will just take and redirect their own forces to that point where they'll try to take advantage of the breakthrough. It would be a very straightforward operation where they'll just do general offensive operations all throughout the front line to see if the Ukrainians are prepared everywhere, and if there's any hole or gap in the Ukrainian defenses, they take advantage of that to break through the Ukrainian defenses and then expand from there. An example of such would be if the Ukrainians did not prepare the defenses properly at Sumy, the Russians would take that as an advantage and try to push through, both sieging the city itself and going besides it, similar to when they started the offensive in February 2022, and use that to flank the Ukrainian positions elsewhere or to cut the roads between the Ukrainians in the west and north from the east and south. There are multiple targets for the Russians in this offensive operation. There's the cities of Kharkiv and Sumy, there's the cities of Poltava, Dnipro, and Zaporizhia. The Kharkiv and Sumy are because of their proximity to the border and the importance of these locations for the Russians to quote-unquote safeguard the Russian territory from shelling of Ukrainians within Ukraine. And the cities of Poltava, Dnipro, and Zaporizhia are mainly based on logistics and supply for the Ukrainians in the south. This is also something that is most likely yet not very expected. That is mainly due to the talk about Kiev and Odessa. The idea that the Russian army would go for these two cities is very strong among everyone following this war. The main reason for that is the Russian rhetoric around these two cities, how Kiev is the stronghold of the political control over Ukraine, capturing it and capturing the Ukrainian leaders would force them into a peace. At the same time, Odessa, the whole southern border, the whole Black Sea border of Ukraine would be under Russian control. They would have a land border to Transnistria as well. They would have full control over the Black Sea border. So many things there as well that is in the interest of the Russians, and them also calling it a Russian city. This all adds up to that being a clear target. So these two being the clear targets of the Russians would make sense, and all of the attention goes there. Like in what Macron said and what Medvedev said, they keep saying and talking about Kiev and Odessa. Yet no one talks about Kharkiv, no one talks about Sumy here in the east. The main reason for that is two things. The first one is if the Russians manage to capture everything east of the Dnipro River, including Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Poltava, Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, etc., then at that point that would result or be the result of a collapse of the Ukrainian army. At that point, the Ukrainians would be unable to defend themselves and the Russians could just move on to Kiev and Odessa unopposed, largely. And the other reason for that is if Kiev and Odessa falls, then there is pretty much no more Ukraine. Ukraine would be limited to Lviv here in the west. In that scenario, the Ukrainians would clearly have lost the war. And that is pretty much the direct sign or the direct showing of Ukraine has lost if the Russians hold Kiev and Odessa, or Kiev or Odessa. Either of them alone can result in a Ukrainian loss, but both of them together would have solidified a Russian victory. But there is an additional point on top of these two, and that is the fact that the Russian advantage right now is pointing towards this war not being surrounded or limited to the east of Ukraine and the south of Ukraine, but instead all of Ukraine. The main reason for that is the Russians have been building up their army to the point that at right now they are very close to, or could even be already equal to, the Ukrainian army in size, in quantity. While the Russians at the same time have a significant firepower advantage, air superiority, air defense superiority, and so much more that allows them to have a significant advantage, not one limited to what we're seeing at the front line, but one bigger than that. If the Russians are committing 100% to the front right now, you would see the front moving, even though the Ukrainians are defending. And the main reason for that is that the biggest Ukrainian strongholds of Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and others along the front line are now in Russian hands. There is the big fortifications left here in the Donetsk region, but the biggest one, the most defended ones, have already been captured by the Russians, with the exception of the Kramatorsk-Konstantinivka line. The rest of them are being built, they're being fortified further, but they will not reach the level of the front line in 2014. As we can see here, the line of defense that was built in 2014 until 2022 is clear as day, as there's a huge difference between that and everything else. And we can see the extension of it with the Surovikin line. So if the Russian army is stronger and the Ukrainian defenses are weaker, and the Russian army is bigger, then all of it adds up to the fighting not taking place just in the south, but expanding towards a Russian offensive. And not one like the Ukrainian offensive that happened last summer. The Ukrainian offensive last summer was a huge mistake by the Ukrainians because they did not have enough forces. It was too little, too late. Now we see that the Russians have been building up since or throughout 2023 and has used 2024, the first months of 2024, to grind down the Ukrainian army while still building up their own, to the point at which right now the Russians have what is expected to be the necessary amount of soldiers and firepower to launch a major summer offensive, and that's why it is expected. Some even expect it to happen in spring and extend into summer. We don't know when they'll take the decision, but we do know that it is one that is very likely to take place, simply to end this war quicker. And that is all the aspects there is to this eastern operation, Operation Dnipro River. And that is going to be all for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.